listening to the Hour of History podcast with your hosts Stephen Bauman and Matthias Fueling and producer James Albel. The Hour of History podcast aims to understand how we know what we know and why the past matters. Without further delay, your Hour of History begins right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. It's Matthias and Stephen, your co-hosts here in the Hour of History studios. How's it going, Matthias?
It's good. This logo, or this slogan's new. I just heard it. Music to my ears.
Good. We're part two Syria.
Yeah. We're delving deeper into Syria. Mostly because I think if you'd listened to our first episode, you would realize, wow, this is really freaking complicated.
Way too big for just one episode.
Yeah, but first we have to, or at least I have to state some factual sort of retractions on what I said in the first episode regarding sort of like the reign of HoH al-Assad. So Syria was not a total dictatorship since it got independence. It had kind of a democratic government. It had sort of various leaders up until the early 1960s when there was a military coup led in part by HoH al-Assad. And so that's how he came into power. And then finally in 1970 is when he took sort of complete dictatorial control of the country. And so HoH al-Assad, and I think he was the head of the Syrian Air Force, and the other officers in the coup with him were all Baathists, right? This like super ultra-nationalist pan-Arabism, which then plays a big part in the dynamics of Syria today. But just a correction on kind of the brief background of the history of Syria.
Yeah, that's important. Anytime you arrive to power through a military coup,
it doesn't speak well.
It's just not very legitimate. No matter what you do.
Well, unless you think politics is about power, man.
Yeah.
I mean, military coup is definitely like the most powerful assertion.
And it seems to be happening more and more, and it happens all over the place.
Military coups are a happening thing in the last 100 years.
Well, and that's a kind of thing, like, if you're going to take political control and you don't have the military, it doesn't matter, right? If you don't have the military supporting you, so this is why a lot of times these movements do start from military coups. And in the Syrian Civil War, I think we were sort of around 2013 where we stopped last episode, the military,
with Obama's red line.
Yeah, with Obama's red line, and the military is of course a foundational part of this conflict because it's an armed conflict.
Yeah, well, I think what's important too with Syria is, we talked a little bit about it last time, but the ethnic kind of minority composition of Syria. The al-Assad family is Alawite. The Alawites are this, to our Western eyes, a kind of strange, quasi-Islamic religious grouping, also rather sort of similar with Jews. It's both sort of religious and an ethnic group within Syria. They generally tended to live in certain areas of Syria, but with increasing urbanization after the dictatorship and the economic development of Syria, a lot of these minorities started to move in from the countryside, from the mountainside, or from the mountain regions into urban areas, which were predominantly Sunni. And then al-Assad, if we just look at the statistics, overwhelmingly favored Alawite officers in the Syrian military. So it's just crazy where you see these huge statistics of all the generals, it's 75% are Alawite, or people leading this tank battalion are all Alawite. And this led to a very serious sense of angst among different groupings in Syria against the Alawite minority, against other minorities. And then of course there's a history of antagonism between Sunnis and some of the minorities, and that becomes important, right? Once the Civil War breaks out, it very quickly turns from just what we imagine to be a nice, popular kind of revolution for liberal democracy and human rights, to then an expression of minority grievance and ethnic violence very quickly, where it's we have to get these bastard Alawites for what they've been doing to our country type of attitude that becomes really prevalent very quickly.
And the ethnic differences also play into how the international world reacts. So it seems each nation has its favorite ethnicity that it wants to come to power.
That's true. And
wants to support.
And as we said last time, it's usually the Kurds for Americans, or Kurds are the most romantic seeming.
Well, even Kurds typically have a big American following, but there's also the Syrian Christians. Any Christian group is going to get a bigger following.
American conservatives love to go on about the persecution of Christians in the Muslim world, and albeit that's true, but they're ignoring a whole range of other minorities that are being oppressed, and also just like other Muslim groups, right? So
these ethnic differences play a huge role in not only how the international community like chooses who to arm and chooses who to support, but also who to accept when they leave the country. So refugees, if you're a Syriac Christian, there's a much better chance. In fact, they're one of the few exemptions of Trump's travel ban. They can come to the United States
because they're seen as like the true victims or something, and not as like the Ismailis or the Druzes or Alawites or Kurds or any other, or even just Shia Muslims in Syria.
But this was like sort of the same, or these ethnic differences. They're not the reason for the Civil War. I just can't see it that way.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors. I think. I mean, Hafiz, by all accounts, right, was a nasty dictator, but he also, by all accounts, was efficient. He was good at being a dictator. Let's put it that way. With all the nastiness that comes with it, but also the efficiency. Bashar, by all accounts, was not so good, which is why things blew up in his face a mere 11, 12 years after coming into power, because it sounds like, from what I've read and from what I've seen talking to people, corruption really skyrocketed under Assad, or under Bashar, as to say, and then he also sort of more egregiously favored Alawite minorities in certain cases, which also created a lot of angst. And then, of course, the Iraq War and the ensuing geopolitical nightmare that happened also helped create problems with Syria's, just like Syrian society. A lot of refugees came into Syria from Iraq, of course, leading to more tension, and then, of course, more sort of amped up Kurdish nationalism with the Iraq War, because we were arming and giving aid to the Kurds, helps push up tensions.
There's also like destabilization through ISIS. So ISIS.
But ISIS doesn't come out until after the Civil War starts. ISIS doesn't really get big until like 2012, 2013.
Yeah, but I mean, the tension's there. I mean, it doesn't just.
No, you're right. I mean, there's a reason why it flares up in 2011 and not any other time. Like all the factors were there. You just need like the catalyst.
We should mention the environment too. Like you can say, it's easier to be a good dictator when, you're not getting blasted with environmental issues. And like, from my understanding, they had a drought. So
they also were going through a big economic crisis, and Bashar was having problems being able to pay the military well. Like even people that were part of like the Syrian like secret service, the Mukhabarat, like weren't getting enough money. And so there's just, everyone's kind of ticked off, right?
And if you look at like the economic charts of what Syria had a lot of oil, but once the Civil War starts, the oil industry's gone. Like those are the first kind of targets. Those are the first places that are taken out, and you can't process oil when there's a war going on. So like losing that, the future also kind of looks bleak. Like it's hard to make money when your number one export isn't going anywhere.
And also, I mean, Bashar is a persona non grata in basically almost all countries now. Most countries cut off diplomatic ties with Bashar and with like the official quote unquote government of Syria, and withdrew their ambassadors. And almost most major Western countries have said that the only way forward is to get rid of Bashar. But increasingly, it looks as if Bashar is going to stay, just given the way the war is being played out, and with Russian backing and Iranian backing.
Yeah. So let's talk about that.
So it's like, so it seems as if real quick. So it seems like I don't know what's going to happen, because it's like its economy's ruined, and Syria under Bashar in the future is going to be just a total black sheep state. Like no, it won't get any aid except from maybe Russia.
And well, when states turn into that, they end up like North Korea and Cuba.
It doesn't look good for Syria.
Yeah. So let's go back to that red line. So when Assad begins to use chemical weapons, the international community said that it was going to react, or at least the United States said that it was going to react. Chemical weapons were used, and no reaction really happened. So what was the world's role? Should the U.S., and this is a question that now we've been asking since 2011, is what does the international community actually do? And
in the case of Syria, not much.
We're talking about billions of dollars have been spent for refugees alone. Turkey's taken millions of them, and it's become a European crisis.
Yeah,
sort of like the immigrant groups leading to this anti-immigrant sentiment.
And Syria's an open corridor for people coming through other places.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's created an international issue because it continues to go. So could that have stopped anything if Obama had not asked Congress and had just used his sort of like executive powers to
just go for it?
Just sent the military in and said, "There's chemical weapons here. NATO's got our back."
It's weird. The perverse way I've been thinking about it is all the reasons that were claimed for invading Iraq in 2003, which we now have learned are like bullshit, and it was like, just all power politics. But all of the idealistic reasons for invading Iraq are the real reasons that are actually happening in Syria now. So it's really just, it's so messed up, right? Where we invade Iraq under false pretense and illusion, and then that creates a situation in Syria which creates all the things that we claim to be invading Iraq for. Those actually exist in Syria, but then we don't go into Syria because those conditions actually are real, because with all their attendant consequences.
So are we going to look? I think it'll be interesting to see, but this might be looked back at as one of the biggest international blunders of history. Like just watching this sort of genocidal civil war with chemical weapons happening.
I mean, maybe. I think also I want to say there's been a war going on in like Central Africa for like 20 years and 10 million people have died. And because it doesn't really have any major geopolitical effect outside of Africa, the international community doesn't. Well, it's done stuff, right? I don't want to be like they've ignored it, but like I feel like that's going to be the real, like 100 years from now. I think that's the thing where people are like, what were like Americans doing when like millions of Africans were being killed in this like bloody 8-way civil war?
Yeah.
So, but you're right. I think Syria is in part that Syria is going to be looked at as a major problem. Maybe not the major screw up, but one of the major screw ups. And I think it's hard because it's a rock and a hard place. Like, if you intervene militarily in this conflict, just imagine the consequences. Even if you're doing it in like 2012, for example, it means you're putting your foot down against Assad. You're going to have to put in lots of money, lots of troops, lots of training. You're going to have to convince, we're assuming this is a European and American coalition, ideally. You're going to have to convince populations that have already been fighting in the Middle East for over like almost 10 years at this point. Keep fighting. People are war weary. The war in Syria would be attendantly, I think, way more brutal than even Iraq or Afghanistan because you'd be directly fighting ISIS. I feel like you'd have a situation like in Iraq where it just became kind of like the honeypot for like most like Muslim radicals in the region, said we need to go to Iraq to fight the Americans. So I think you would have seen an attendant like, every would-be jihadi in the region would have flocked, as they already were flocking to Syria, but they would have flocked, I think, in even greater numbers. You could have done it, and I think, but it would have been an attendantly brutal, nasty, expensive endeavor. And probably, if you're a politician, not going to help your chances of getting reelected, right?
In fact, that was a lot of Trump's platform was we need to just leave the Middle East. It's not our deal.
Yeah, and he got a lot. I feel like that's an underrated reason for some of his popularity.
Yeah,
is because he's sort of the guy who was saying we just need to leave, wash our hands of it. But the thing is, if you don't intervene, as we haven't, you also see what's happening, which is a nasty, crap storm of different groupings. And even I think what's happened where, basically Assad is engaged in in killing everybody, and the opposition is engaged in just sort of like double crossings and dealings, and then ISIS and other jihadi groups and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra Front are engaged in a kind of genocidal orgy of destruction. And it would have been a hard thing if no intervention happened to say, well, we have the moral high ground on this,
right?
Because it's happening in your back door. And also, if you don't intervene, you also get the huge exodus of refugees. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But I feel like what's happened is the Americans, and I feel to an extent some of the European powers, have done like the worst option, which is like they haven't done a full-scale military intervention, which seems to be, if you really think about it, the only actual solution to the problem,
right,
based on the rhetoric. And yet there hasn't been a total washing of hands, because we still provide money and weapons and training to various groups, and a lot of the arguments are that this isn't actually helping to fuel the conflict. Like a conflict that would have ended 2 or 3 years ago, probably with an Assad victory, just given Assad's more material sort of power, having more money and weapons, it would have been bad for Syria, but the conflict would have been over. Whereas the Americans and the Europeans providing more money and weapons to the opposition forces helps keep the spark of the conflict going, because we give them enough to keep fighting, but we don't give them enough to ever gain an edge in the fighting itself, and so we just keep the spiral going.
Well, it's sort of like the beneficiaries of the war, selling of weapons, of the production of weapons, and so that's, I've heard so many people say that it's so simple. Russia and the United States just need to stop giving weapons to people, and there's Saudi Arabia, Iran doing it too. But the contradiction between pumping weapons and military aid, but not actual military intervention, while at the same time spending billions of dollars for the UN in terms of refugee relief and International Red Cross, Red Crescent, billions of dollars. So Iran will send 100 million blankets to refugees, and then they'll also start arming military groups. It's just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and the thing is just irreconcilable visions of what people want in Syria. You can't, the opposition groups, the leading opposition groups, the more secular opposition groups say, we want to get rid of Assad and establish this more democratic society. That's a no-go for Assad. Mm-hmm. Assad is not willing to leave. He's willing. He's not even really willing to make concessions, right? Those are irreconcilable. And then groups like ISIS or various sort of Al-Qaeda offshoots, of course, have a totally irreconcilable vision of establishing a new caliphate. And you can't negotiate with these people. That's why I feel it's a fantasy for the UN and America to try and engage in diplomacy, because they're irreconcilable. You can't make a negotiated peace because Assad, and also, you might think, well, what if we partition Syria, right? What if we Kurds, you get the north,
right?
Whatever, the opposition gets the east, and Bashar gets the west. It's no side wants that. Maybe the Kurds would want that, but they also have their own vision of a bigger, grander
right,
northern state that encompasses northern Iraq, and so these are not things that they're all in for getting total control of Syria, both sides, and so it's just a total mess to think that you could negotiate that. And so I guess I come down on the side that either we just wash our hands of it, and no decision is going to be morally, pure. Lots of people are going to die no matter what decision gets made. That's the point we're at. Either the U.S. and Europe needs to just buckle up and do a full-scale military intervention, aka you put 100,000 troops on the ground and you kill anybody who keeps fighting, mm-hmm, and you basically kill Assad,
which would have to be a NATO intervention.
And you kill Assad and you get rid of the government leadership. You establish a new government and you sit there and you make it work. But we tried to do that in Iraq, and that was horrible.
Yeah.
Or we just wash our hands of it entirely and not keep funding weapons and money that keeps fueling the conflict. I don't think there's a good third option.
Yeah, and even both of those options, as impressive, as they seem, they might, bring some sort of a solution to it. One thing that you also have to consider is the just absolute massive human displacement. So even if you do establish a new government, what does that mean? That the Syrians who are in Sweden, the 60,000 Syrians, are they going to come back?
Yeah, will the Syrian refugees come back?
And is their house going to be gone? And
then that's a whole nother, it's another nightmare, because then imagine people coming back and their homes are destroyed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is the U.S. and Europe going to rebuild those houses?
Yeah, exactly.
Say that, maybe the person that killed their father for some, say you're a young Syrian man, and say you're an Alawite, and say you went, you left the country, and then you come back and you find that your Sunni neighbor that killed your dad is still living in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, but see, it's we have lived through these like prolonged. So like as 1990, the Yugoslav War.
But that's still, I mean, Yugoslavia is
it's still a tense.
It's still a tense spot. I mean, there's still lots of angst in Serbia.
Absolutely, but the world has in some way like through sort of like a economic growth in former Yugoslavia. So like Serbia is becoming a more modern state and being developed. Places like Kosovo and Albania like are experiencing more economic growth and continued support from nations like the United States. They have been able to recover somewhat, even though those like underlying tensions still exist. Like, I mean, when you go to Serbia, you think like it was 20 years ago. This guy was obviously a part of it, and you can talk to people and hear people who survived like the siege of Sarajevo. Like that's almost a best case scenario because Gouda is in a siege right now.
Yeah,
so
but I mean, if you what was the casualty rate in the Balkan Wars?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, Syria is already far surpassed that. I mean,
right.
Like over 10 million people are refugees. About 500,000 people have been killed. We don't know the details, but obviously all the atrocities you associate with brutal wars of like mass killings,
right,
mass rapes,
genocide, and I'm sure we're going to find out more. I'm sure
in coming years we're going to find out about mass graves.
Absolutely,
we're going to find out about all kinds of atrocities, and so I think that in some ways it's too far gone for a kind of live and let live situation because it's sort of reached the point of like Eastern Europe in World War II, where it's like either one side's going to win or one side's going to lose. There's no way they can come to an agreement. You can't usually come to some sort of reconcilable agreement with the forces of the people that like raped your mother and burned your house down and like killed
they've
you.
done it in Yugoslavia.
I don't know, and I feel like you might be too hopeful on the Balkans. I personally think the Balkans is ready to blow up again.
No, well, okay, yeah, and again, of course, Russia like sending its motorcycle king, but that's not what we're talking about.
The Night Wolves.
The Night Wolves. But the one thing that the Balkans and Eastern Europe had in their benefit was that they were European. I think being in the Middle East...
Well, they got a ton of aid.
Exactly.
They also, I mean, that's what we don't talk about is like, why did Europe recover after the war? Particularly Western Europe was the Marshall Plan, and then in Eastern Europe it was still a mess for like up to 2 decades afterwards, but I mean the Soviets did try and do some sort of cleanup.
That's not going to happen in Syria.
That's not going to happen in Syria, and so...
It's kind of like Iraq.
Yeah, and which is a mess, right? And I don't know, I mean, and so this is like the more... I mean, I think everyone agrees that Assad is a nasty character, and he's proven himself with his actions in the Civil War. I mean, just mass atrocities, mass rapes by the Syrian regime forces, chemical weapons attacks, the whole 9 yards, horrific torture and executions and like in the prisons. And yet, there's also this polemical position. It's like, well, he's like the least bad option because who else is going to like, the opposition can't win outside of a full-scale Western military intervention, which isn't going to happen. And if you don't back Assad, ISIS or various jihadi groups are going to win out. And that a sort of an Islamist dictatorship in Syria would be worse than like a secular dictatorship under Assad. So the logic goes, well, we should support Assad insofar as Assad is a buffer against the rise of like a radical Muslim state. And that's sort of the argument, that's like the polite argument that's used to justify Russia's intervention. Because they say Russia had like, the cojones to be like, well, someone needs to do something.
They stepped in. And
we are going to step in and do it because the Americans and the Europeans haven't. And then they have turned on their propaganda machine to be like, this is the correct thing to do. And, blah, 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 blah. And then also, I mean, just in geopolitical terms, it also is in Russia's interest to create a secular dictatorship or to buffer against, a radical Muslim state, because Russia's not that far.
Right.
Russia's pretty close.
Okay.
You just have to go through the Caucasus to get to Russia.
Okay, so but that's one thing. So Russia actually steps into the conflict in 2015, and since Russia steps in, Assad's regime starts winning. And if you look at the maps now,
because they start giving them overwhelming air power.
They've almost defeated entirely the Free Syria. But is this sort of getting out of Syria? This is a chance the world had to stand up to Russia outside of direct confrontation with Russia, because no one was willing to stand up to Russia when they took Crimea in 2014.
Yeah.
No one in eastern Ukraine.
But that's like the rhetoric that people used about Clinton, right, during the campaign. Going back to kind of Trump's claims of we shouldn't intervene, is like a lot of people were saying, if Clinton gets elected, it's going to be World War III,
right,
because she's going to intervene in Syria, which is going to lead to some sort of conflict with Russia, and then all hell's going to break loose. That was sort of one of the arguments. And that's one of the arguments now is why no one should intervene in Syria, is because now that Russia's involved, the jig is up, because if you intervene at this point, Russia's going to veto anything you put up in the UN. Russia's going to raise all kinds of hell if you try to intervene. Probably like some sort of tariff or like trade war with oil and natural gas they'll do. And then as well, there's a good chance you're going to wipe out maybe some Syrian warplanes, or some Russian warplanes, or some Russian mercenary troops, but not sort of accidentally or under the cover of the United States, the forces that are backed by the U.S. killed these Russian mercenaries. It would be U.S. troops killing Russian troops, which has never happened.
Well, okay, so but let's recap.
So it would be
so now
big.
We've let Russia constantly veto UN action on Syria. We let Russia annex a sovereign part of Ukraine. We let Russia send troops into Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation. We've let Russia poison former Russians on NATO ground. And we're going to go in 78 days and celebrate them at the World Cup.
The World Cup.
And so this is just appeasement, is it not? No one's ever going to stand up to Russia. This is how Putin has won.
Well, that is the argument. That's an argument. Is it worth the confrontation?
Well, it might have been to the Ukrainians who don't have a home anymore,
or to the Syrians, I guess, right? But that's the thing, is right. Is the rights of a small minority worth the confrontation that could affect the lives of a lot vaster group of people? And I think that's also why Syria, you see a lot of the weird replication of issues that came up during the Spanish Civil War, or 1930s era sort of geopolitics of what is the role of Europe, what is the role of America in the world, right? Because that was rhetoric about the Spanish Civil War. This was a parallel I always think of when I think of the Syrian War, is that we can't back the Republican anti-Franco forces because they're being backed by Nazi Germany, and we don't want to antagonize Hitler. Only say Stalin and the Soviets were willing to send aid, but only to basically make the Republicans into communists.
There were some communists among them.
Well, sure. Yeah, we do. Are the Kurds the POUP of our time?
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting question, and I think there are a lot of sort of rhymes with 1930 with the rise of these rightist groups.
And but the thing is, that was an argument. You still find it in certain quarters of why World War II is a mistake. You find this in weird right-wing quarters of we shouldn't, that, or in Britain, for example, this was Oswald Mosley's big line, was Britain has a sovereign interest, right? We should just take care of Britain and the empire. Why do we give a damn about what happens in Europe? If why did we sign this pact with Poland? If Hitler wants to invade Poland and go to war with whoever on the continent, that's his business, none of ours. It's not worth another world war,
right?
This is the appeasement argument, the sort of if Hitler and Stalin eventually go to war, better that they duke it out and kill each other and we will just sort of sit tight and watch it go down. And if we ever get attacked, then we'll deal with it. But in the meantime, we're not going to do anything.
Which is kind of like built on this faulty premise that you can just sit back and your world won't be affected. But
Yeah.
we, especially even more so now.
Yeah.
But in the 1930s as well, it was such a globalized world already. You can't say what happens in Syria won't.
Yeah, and
impact
well, we
us.
definitely see with the refugee crisis. That,
Absolutely.
And like in my ideal perfect geopolitical world, what would happen is it would be the EU would step up. Shocking. Oh my God,
Yeah.
the EU is effective. The EU would form a military coalition with different governments. They would send in like a big military force. I'm talking like 100,000, 200,000 troops that would take out Assad, take out the jihadi forces, establish some sort of coalition government, and then make it work with a long-term occupation of like 5 years, try to create some sort of repatriation program for the refugees, and try and stabilize the region and help the people in Europe who have fled the conflict to not just make Syria solve the problem in Syria, also to solve like problems in Europe's back door that if they don't do anything is going to light their house on fire, and also to help the refugees, because if they don't do anything, you're just going to see this massive stream of people leave the area and go to Europe, which is going to further fuel sectarian conflicts in Europe and strengthen right-wing authoritarian governments, which I know is like sort of a bad thing. It's like blaming the victim, right? Where it's like, and so I know it's sort of a morally nasty thing for me to say that, right? Because it would say like, people shouldn't have to, refugees should be allowed to come in and not have to deal with antagonism.
Right.
But that's also like, but we live in the real world where that is going to create antagonism. And it's not like a comment on the moral nature of the refugees, but on the fact that their presence in and of itself will create conflict with people in Europe, which is more, I guess, an indictment of people in Europe than it is of the refugees. But you still have to deal with the fact that, that the growth of right-wing authoritarian governments in Europe is not a good thing.
Right, absolutely not. And I think part of this idea and part of these problems stem from the view Europe has of separation between Europe and the Middle East. Europe,
there's Asia,
yes,
and then there's Europe.
Even though the Istanbul is on both sides somehow miraculously.
Syria is probably closer to Paris.
Absolutely.
Than
Moscow maybe.
Way closer than Moscow,
yeah.
but even closer than in the U.S., closer than say New York City to Kansas or something. It's America's a big country, but that's really not that far.
Right.
I mean that's
but there is a block. Slavoj Žižek, did a famous video where he started in Slovenia, and this is what he was talking about during the Yugoslav wars. And he said, once I cross this bridge from Italy into Slovenia, I become a rapist, a murderer, Yugoslav who wants to destroy the world. I'm non-European as soon as I cross this bridge. And it took Yugoslavia, and they're still working on it. Albanians still aren't really considered Europe. They're Balkan.
The Greeks.
Yeah, the Greeks. So they've been fighting that for centuries, trying to be part of Europe, right? And so Syria's chances of making that appeal to the European Union are almost zero.
Yeah, it's bad though, because all these people are going to be left homeless, and they're going to go on these refugee trips, and the European governments don't know how to deal with them. Most of those Balkan states, we should add, aren't accepting refugees.
No. They're letting them march right through.
Yeah. And so it's really they're gonna go to Germany or France or Britain, which is gonna fuel people like the Alternative for Deutschland.
Absolutely.
It's gonna fuel Le Pen. It's weird, people have a short memory, it seems, where people are like, well, Le Pen lost the last election, so she's gone forever.
No way.
Or something. It's like, man, she's gonna be around for a while,
especially if things continue going the way they are.
and her daughter, is it Marichal Le Pen?
Mm-hmm.
Right, spoke at the latest CPAC here in the States, so they've got backing from conservative forces in the States.
And as long as member states of the European Union are openly refusing refugees, have zero...
So I think so. So the Syrian crisis, they're double crisis, right? They fuel each other.
Yeah.
The EU's inability to get its act together, because no state is really willing to give up what I guess we'd say a certain degree of sovereignty in exchange for like mutual security.
Yeah.
Which I think is the only real route into the future for Europe.
Right. Well, this might be like kind of a Cold War approach, but Russia provides a villain. Like, I think this is what Theresa May was trying to do with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom with this Skripal poisoning, is she was trying to bring Britain back into Europe and say, okay, Britain needs to stand with its European allies against Russia, and it got shot down almost immediately by the British press and by the, you know...
Well, it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black a little bit, you know, after Brexit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the EU's inability to get its act together fuels the destabilization in Syria because no one can do anything that could help end the crisis, and no one's willing to. And then the crisis in Syria, as it ramps up, is going to lead to more death and more refugees coming into the EU, which is going to further accelerate, you know, the crisis in the EU. It's bad.
So then let's look towards the future. So Assad has the rebel base of Aleppo's gone.
Yeah.
Assad has that. The rebels are almost completely defeated. There is a northern Syria that's run largely by the Kurds.
Rojava.
So they have nominal independence, but that'll be where Assad turns his attention.
And
next.
also that area is being attacked by Turkey.
Yeah.
But Turkey, albeit I'm not the biggest fan of Erdogan or...
Well, he wants the crisis to end.
Yeah, he wants the crisis to end. Well, because also it's a problem for Turkey because... The refugees going through Turkey is a problem for Turkey, but also it's a problem that the Kurds are starting to assert kind of a national sovereign state because there's a big Kurdish minority in Turkey that has been engaged in like a terrorist campaign against the Turkish government with like bombings and suicide attacks.
It's not what the Kurds say.
Yeah, well, they're wrong. And so
what's amazing is this was going on. Ignatieff was writing about this in Blood and Belonging in the early 90s.
Well, like these problems don't go away.
No, and they won't.
And not for a long time. And so you know, Turkey has declared that Rojava, this like independent kind of Turkish or Kurdish state in the north, is affiliated with the terrorist campaign in Turkey, and ergo it's a terrorist state and it's a threat to Turkish, you know, sovereignty. So Turkey's intervening. That's like the big thing that blew up like on social media and Twitter was like when the Turks invaded and took over Afrin. Yeah. Right? It was sort of like we're taking it back for like the free Turks. And it's like Erdogan's like a slimy SOB. Like I hate Erdogan. I hate like the Turkish dictatorship. And yet, right, you can see their national interests at play. Like, everyone has a certain national interest. And I think what's going to happen is those national interests are going to go in the direction of stability. And the only key to stability right now is just they're ensuring Assad's victory. Which sucks, because Assad is a nasty, evil butcher.
And once Assad gets victory and say, okay, so let's assume that within the next few months, Assad's going to eliminate the rebels. And let's say it doesn't turn...
we're not even talking about like what's going to happen to the jihadis.
Exactly.
They're also not going away.
But it also doesn't... Let's just assume it doesn't turn into World War III. Assad wins. He just clamps down, kills anyone.
Yeah, there's going to be like... I mean, when he wins, there's going to be a purge. We're going to hear about all kinds of atrocities. More people are going to flee the state.
Exactly.
Or he's going to close the borders, and that'll be even worse.
Yeah.
And so all the refugees outside of Syria right now, I think we can basically assume are never going back to Syria.
And then what? And then so the UN has lost all credibility. The Security Council cannot do anything.
Russia will be able to sort of pound its chest and be like, we did it.
At the World Cup. I'm thinking they tried to close this Syria thing before the World Cup.
Yeah, well, I think they want to as well, because if you've been following the news, there's been ever-increasing kind of ratcheting up of tensions between American-backed forces in Syria, even some like American special advisors, aka special forces, in Syria versus Russian mercenaries, right? When was that like artillery attack that killed like 200 Russians? So like that's ranching up tension, and so it's in Russia's interest to stop it
as soon as
possible. And so Russia will beat its chest, but I mean Syria will be a total ruin. Assad will clamp down and kill quite a few more people, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more. it's going to be a nightmare, and Syria will have no standing in the world, and it'll be basically a kind of ruined state. It'll I mean, it's really depressing.
It'll be a pariah state, yeah. So then I always like to.
I mean, we should just.
At the end of these depressing talks, no, I like to say.
We should just assassinate Assad. I'm sorry, like,
no,
that's gonna, like, I know there's gonna be some flack, but, like, come on, man. Like, we should just fucking get a drone, blow him up. I'm sorry.
But so that's.
But then, of course, security, yada yada.
So then, what should regular people do? We so now you've listened.
I don't know if regular people can do anything.
Well, yeah, regular people can always do something. I mean, they're like the way that we consume news, the way that we talk about these sort of things, they all have an impact. I mean, we don't necessarily have as many Twitter followers as Trump.
Help Syrian refugees if and where you can, I think, is like the biggest thing that like local average Joes and Janes can do, is try and do something to help refugees of this conflict.
Even if it is just talking to people about refugees and or talking to refugees, and
or if you can, like, send, you know, I don't know, like, just blankets. I mean, it sounds so like stupid, right? Because there's so, it's so little, but it's you know, a lot of this can add up, and I think that's the biggest thing, is a lot of these refugees, as we said earlier, are never going home.
Right.
And they're in a hostile environment. A lot of them are like young men who fled because they knew if they stayed they'd be killed or they'd be drafted into one fighting force or another.
Yeah.
So they're, you know, kind of in a world of pain dealing with that, and then also just sort of latent Islamophobia, or not even I'd say Islamophobia, but just like latent like racism against Arabs.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see what our European listeners have to say, especially because Europe is really, you know, they can't just say travel ban, and it's a lot harder for refugees to get to the United States.
Yeah, and also our oceans are a nice sort of natural barrier.
Yeah.
Also, I feel like the problem with EU is that a lot of these refugees, the impulse is to like kind of like push them aside or be like, we'll accept you, but we're not really going to fully integrate you, or we're not really going to fully accept you, which just leads to the phenomenon like we see in France, where you see a lot of this like Arab population ends up living in like these banlieues or like these like slum ghetto areas, which further increases anger, fuels right-wing fantasies, but it also fuels radicalization among young Muslims, because if you're discriminated against and you're not accepted in society, it's really easy for you to like latch on to something really nasty ideologically. And so it's going to be a problem if the EU doesn't do something to try and help these refugees and integrate them. It's going to create more problems than it would not.
Right. Shortly after World War II, in 1951, the United Nations got together and signed a document agreeing that refugees had rights too, and that they should be treated like people, given jobs, you know, incorporated into society. Almost every nation signed it. The United States signed a different document in 1960 that had a little different wording, but we even still signed it. This was in the shadow of World War II, and like people had lived with the enormous amount of loss and enormous amount of refugees. We have these sort of things in place already. People need to look back and talk to historians.
But international law isn't worth like a pile of beans if states aren't willing to follow it.
Right. So, elect people willing to follow international law.
Elect people that are saying we should help Syrian refugees.
Absolutely.
That's the biggest thing you can probably do.
And that's the best conclusion I think we can come to today. Thanks for listening.
I'm Matthias Fueling.
And I'm Stephen Bauman. And on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
Anywhere. Have a good one, guys.